then, since we need that policy capacity, indeed, we can't have global markets without that policy capacity, then, since we live in, all of us, relatively imperfect democracies, right? We don't live in authoritarian regimes. Then we need to find new ways to make that kind of policy action legitimate so that people will accept it. That's what I'm basically talking about here. So this is not brain surgery, Dr. Xi, right? This is much more difficult, much more difficult. This is easy. Brain surgery is difficult. This is easy. We know what we need to do. Well, now the hard thing is we need wise leaders like Dr. Xi and Mrs. Ip to actually help us do things that we don't really want to do. Partly it's a matter of education, but there's all kinds of other aspects to this. All right, let me, since a colleague, friend from the Bank for International Settlements is here, let me be even more specific in institutional terms about, I think, the mistakes that we're making at the moment and where we actually need to go in the future. You've all heard of the, have you heard about the Financial Stability Board? Yes. You're in the financial markets, you know all about it. Okay, there we go. How many people have heard of Jacques Polak, who is the chief economist of the IMF from the beginning until actually very recently? He just died in his 96th year. Even though he had long since retired from the IMF, he continued to go to the office as a distinguished senior advisor until maybe 3-4 years ago. So there from the beginning. One of the most distinguished macroeconomists of his generation, founding father of international monetary economics. His career began in the League of Nations in 1937. In 1947, he joined the fund as the chief of the statistics division. 1958, he took over its research department, turned it into an intellectual powerhouse. In 1981, he became the Dutch executive director of the fund and later an advisor. He and his colleague, Sir Joseph Gold, who was the legal counterpart, really built the fund, and for me, they represented the ideal of international public service, and an ideal that was imperfectly realized in the post-war period, but they, for me, always symbolized it. Now, on one historical and analytical point, Polak and I had a long-standing difference of opinion, and we'd returned to it in public and in private many times. I think the difference is quite relevant when we think about the Financial Stability Board, which is being called these days the fourth pillar of global economic governance, right? Mr. Geithner is all... Have you written a paper about this? Mr. Geithner is talking about it that way. In my dialogue with Polak I depicted the history of global economic and financial governance, the post-war history of the fund and the U.S. system of which it remains a part, as continuous with the history of the League. As in, we actually learned some things from our unpleasant history in the 20th century. The condition, I thought, was not just symbolic. The League's economic and financial files, for instance, there was something called in the League the Economic and Financial Organization, which was meant to be the political authority underneath globalizing, what we call today globalizing markets. Didn't work then, but they tried. Polak was there. The files of the League were passed on to the UN, and Polak and a couple of his colleagues went directly from the League to the fund, or to the UN. Now, we all know what we think about the UN, right? Not very much. We don't think much about the UN. And some of the people in this room might think have a little bit more respect for the IMF. Not really, right? we don't really think about it in particularly positive terms, especially in Asia after the Asian financial crisis, right? Pollack, on the other hand, in any case, I see a continuous evolution. Pollack, on the other hand, saw a significant turning point occurring with the establishment of the fund. The word he and Gold preferred to use to describe the fund's basic function neatly encapsulated the different, what they thought was the different character of post-war monetary arrangements. The word was regulation. They didn't hesitate to use the word regulation. They were authorized to regulate. Now, when I first heard them say this, I said, no, you're not. And if you try to do that, nobody's going to listen. Only legitimate national governments can regulate. But they insisted that this was not the world of the League. This was a new world where states created by treaty an international organization, gave it political authority, a mandate, a mission, a clear mission, and the resources. And one more thing. Staff. Competent staff who are beholden to no national authority. Now here, my friend from the BIS already sees where this is going, because it's key. Pollack always wanted to emphasize, though, that the League had been too political, as in not professional, and not in a strong position to advocate the subordination of narrow national interests to common global interests. The League lacked clear authority. Its consensus decision-making practice, that is, everybody around the table had a veto, everything was decided by consensus, made it too cautious. It often could not rise above petty concerns. It became politicized. Despite some modest successes in the 1920s, when systemic financial crises actually emerged, it found itself on the sidelines, without resources, without legitimacy. Its small economic staff had, by the 1930s, maybe a little analytical mission. They were academics, right? I love being an academic, but we don't really feel we have any serious authority. More than once, Pollack recalled for me the image of Alexander Loveday, the last head of the economic and financial organization of the League, spending his time at Bretton Woods, wandering around very lonely all by himself at the Mount Washington Hotel, with nobody paying any attention to him. In fact, Pollack disliked what historians had come to call the EFO. He didn't think the acronym meant anything. He thought it was too grand. He believed that no such organization ever existed. The fund, on the other hand, was different. Again, it had authority delegated by ratified treaty, a decision-making process unbound by the unanimity principle, financial resources, at least initially, adequate to the task, and most importantly, a highly qualified, apolitical, knowledgeable, technocratic, legally independent, and politically neutral staff. Although I very much valued and respected the ideal lying behind that perspective, and I'm going to defend it today, I interpreted that result differently. That the League staff seemed political was a function of the character of the dominant civil service bureaucracy lying behind it, namely the British civil service, with its tradition of gentlemen, pragmatists, generalists, seeking consensus and doing whatever needed to be done. Pragmatism ruled, and principles often had to be stretched to cover facts. Certainly the League reflected the rather open-ended liberal internationalist ethos of the post-1918 era. If you want to get a little picture of this, read Liaquat's Lords of Finance on the bestseller lists at the moment. And the fund was shaped by a more directive Keynesianism, but Keynes himself was unhappy with the way his ideal was in fact translated into reality. That the fund was structured very differently from the League, I argued, was mainly a function of now dominant American bureaucratic norms. That is, the attempt to resolve fundamental distributive contests through formally transparent